Hello, and thank you for coming to my session. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in person in Houston, but I hope you're having a fantastic conference. This is the session for Microsoft Dynamics GP development and choosing the right tool. So we're going to be going through a number of the different tools available to you as developers. And we've got a 90-minute session. I don't know if I'm going to take all of it, but I will try to show you in detail exactly the choices you have. So my name is David Musgrave. I'm the owner and Managing Director of Winthrop Development Consultants based in Perth, Australia. I'm a Microsoft Dynamics MVP and also a GPUG All-Star. I've been working with the GP product since 1994, and that includes 13 and a half years without a soul at Microsoft. It does come back when you leave. Eventually. Just a quick note before we get started. I'm going to be in a Teams meeting for the duration of the session. I'll put this link up again at the end, but if you'd like to join a Teams meeting and ask any questions as the session goes along, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you at the end of the session when we've got some time for Q&A. Thank you. So, what we're going to be doing is we're going to cover the different tools available, and that includes Modifier with VBA, the Visual Studio tools, Microsoft Dexterity, also GP Power Tools, which is my product, and we'll have a talk about surface-based architecture. We're also going to be covering the integration side of things, which we'll cover a few different tools, including Table Import, Integration Manager, eConnect, and Web Services. So we'll start with the customization tools. So these are the tools for modifying the user interface. We're going to have VBA, and then we'll go into Visual Studio, and we'll talk about how you can use Visual Studio to replace VBA. Then we'll look at Microsoft Dexterity, the actual language that GP is written in, and UI standards as well. Okay. So one thing to note is you mustn't be scared of the concept of hybrid development. There are many tools available, and you need to mix and match the tools to get the result you want. So if one tool can't do everything, there is no problem using another tool or using multiple tools to achieve what you need. As long as it works, it's a good solution. So starting with Modifier for VBA, the VBA part of this, I need to make this very clear, is end of life. It's not being developed any further and is not compatible with the web client, and it also doesn't work on a number of the new Windows service platforms, and at this stage is a possibility it might not work on Windows 11 either. So it's a good tool for power users and partner consultants, and it has the ability to modify Windows in any product, and that's using the modifier part. And then using VBA, we can automate the user interface, we can add business rules, we can reference the system dialogues. It does work with reports, but it has no access to the underlying business logic or table structures. You can get to tables, but you have to go out through SQL and ADO.NET. So the way this will work is after we've gone through each of the tools, we'll have a look at a demo and show it in action. So we'll start with Modifier and VBA. So here we have Dynamics, and we're going to be modifying the customer maintenance window. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding a reason for change as a field down the bottom here. And we're going to add in the appropriate code to make it save, read, and so on. So we'll start by using the modifier. So we're going to go to Tools and Customize and modify the current window. We'll start by increasing the size of the window. So I just want to get myself a bit more space. Now I can drag it down, but it's actually better to resize it by just adding an appropriate number to it. So we're going to actually increase this by 19 which is the grid size. So that'll go up to 44, 43. So then I can pick up all of the bottom part of the window and move it down, including the line. And now I've got the space here to add in the extra field that I want. So we're just going to create a local field, and we're going to call it reason for change. And it's going to be a string of 100. And then we'll drag that out onto the window. And then I'm going to use the align tools to align it to the position I want. So first of all, I'm going to bring it up so it's at the same vertical position, and then the same horizontal position, and then I can bring it down to where I want. And I'm going to add in a prompt, reason for change. Now these steps I actually have all recorded in a macro, but I decided not to use the macro this time because we had a 90-minute session, which gives us a little bit more time to show it. So I'm making it the same length. Okay, and then we're going to turn the border to 3D highlight, which adds the underline, and turn it border true. So now you can see we've got the underline there. We also need to link our prompt. And after linking the prompt, we should also set our tab sequence. So I'm just pressing tab and letting it move through the fields. And you get down to where you want the field to be. When it moves to the incorrect field, then you double click and redirect it back to where you want. So I think we'll make this after that price level. So now it goes to accounts, so I'm going to say no, double click and make it go here, and then to accounts. So that sets the tab sequence. So that's all the changes we need on the window. So we can come back to GP. Okay, and once we're back in GP, we're able to open the window. Now, GP Power Tools is actually offering me the choices, and I had set this up previously to allow me to open up either the original or the modified. So the standard security is telling me to open up the original, and you can see that we don't have access to that new field. So if we want access to that new field, we would need to change under administration, user security, and we pull up our user in our current company, and it gives us the alternate forms modified ID that's been used. And then we can come over to the alternate forms modified, choose a window. Probably should have selected series first. That would have gone to sales and sped this process up. And then we can choose customer maintenance and choose the modified version. Save that. So now when we open the window, home, customer maintenance, you'll see that the star is on the modified one, and so by default it will open the modified one, which then gives us access to the new field. You'll notice there's a dot at the beginning of the window name that tells us that this is a modified window. So the next part of the customization is to add this to VBA. So we want to add this to VBA, and to do that we need to add a number of the buttons. For example, the save and delete button needs to be added, and our problem here is that we can't actually add those to VBA when the ribbons are on. The ribbons are not actually dexterity buttons, and therefore we can't actually get access to the original buttons. So we're going to need to turn the ribbon off. Now again, I've normally got a macro that I use to run this, but we're going to take a bit more of a detailed approach. So we need to come into our user preferences and tell it to use the menu bar. You'll need to exit and relaunch GP. Access. And once GP is fully loaded, we can then come back in, go back into our customer maintenance to the modified version of the window, and you'll see now we've got the original buttons. So now we can go up to Tools, Customize. We can add this window to Visual Basic, Tools, Customize, and then we can come down to Add Fields, and we need to add the Reason for Change field, the Customer ID field, the Save button, and the Delete button. Then we can go back to Tools and turn off Add Fields. So now if we go to the Visual Basic Editor, Customize, and Visual Basic Editor, and open up Microsoft Dynamics GP objects, you'll see Customer Maintenance there, double click, and we've got the window. So now I'm not going to type all of this out in front of you, so I'm going to pop into the VBA and grab the scripts. So these are standard scripts that you'll see. They're available online, plus I will be posting all of the code from this project onto my blog, so keep an eye out on winthropdc.com/blog. Okay, so this is going to handle what we call the CRUD events, that is create, read, update and delete. So this is going to, first of all, we've got before window opens, we're actually putting in setting a default value of reason for change, and after you've set default values you should set the change flag on the window back to false, so that tracks that whether the window has been a change on the window, and it stops it opening up the do you want to save, delete or discard or cancel when you just close the window if you've done nothing on the window. So we got, when you change a customer ID, we need to read a record, and we're going to store our data in the DUOS, which is the Dynamic User Object Store, and it is actually implemented as the SY 90,000 table in the company database, but it's an easily accessible table structure that we can store data in in the SQL from VBA. So when we read our customer, we're setting up some flags to say whether we're planning to delete. So at the moment we're not going to delete. Then we can also reset the value on the field. So if it's a record that we read in and it doesn't have a reason for change, that we can actually populate it with that enter reason for change. So we've got the save button, so that's when we're saving our record. We've got handling of delete, and we've also got handling of the do you want to save changes to this debtor or to this customer. You can see we have both there. And do you want to delete as well? We've got the handling for the delete. So if we now say debug and compile, and we now pull up a record, and you'll see here it says test update. Now if I just hit clear, you'll see it says please enter a reason the record was changed, and we can put in because it is conference time. Save, and you'll see that when they come back, because it is conference time, is there. So there you go. That is all functional and working with a small amount of VBA code. And we'll save that, and we'll come back to our presentation. So another tool available to us is the Visual Studio tools for Microsoft Dynamics GP. And these are a suite of tools that allows Visual Studio developers using C# or Visual Basic.NET to access, reference and use objects within Microsoft Dynamics GP. It gives them full access to all of the standard .NET functionality, but they also have the ability to work with GP. They can create new WinForms, which can be Dexterity-like in their appearance, but there is a caveat, which I'm just going to mention a bit further on, about compatibility. You can create events or handlers for events in GP, so anything that happens at the user interface. We can also create events on the underlying business logic, and we can call most of the underlying business logic. So it gives us a lot better controls. We also have access to the tables within any of the Microsoft Dynamics GP or third-party products without needing to use ADO or SQL. So again, that's much better than VBA. It doesn't work very easily with reports. You can't modify a report, but there is a technique to use report writer functions with Visual Studio tools. So when I was talking about the forms, the thing to remember is if you want to use the web client, the HTML5 web clients do not support WinForms. So if you use WinForms, they will not be available within the web client. The Silverlight client did support a WinForm using a Silverlight form, but that's only for GP 2013, which most of you won't be on anymore. So now, if you want to use Visual Studio tools for Microsoft Dynamics GP, the templates for Visual Studio 2010 through to 2015 come through on the installer that's on the Microsoft DVD image in the tools folder. But if you want the templates for later on, they're not actually included in that. However, our colleague Tim Woppert in the UK has created templates and published them, and they can be downloaded from inside Visual Studio, and he's got a blog article which I've linked to here that explains how that all works. So thanks, Tim, for your help. That was it's an awesome gift to the community. So I'm not actually going to do a demo on Visual Studio Tools by itself. What we're going to do is we're going to look at Visual Studio Tools when we use it with the modifier as a replacement technique for VBA. So this is web client compatible as long as we're not using WinForms. The modifying a form with modifier is web client compatible, and adding the business logic with Visual Studio Tools is web client compatible. So we use the forms with which we modify with the modifier. Then we run the DAG tool, which is the dictionary assembly generator, and that creates a DLL, which is a representation of the dictionary, which can be used by Visual Studio. We do that against the modified forms dictionary so that we're able to access all the changes that were made in the modified form, like the additional fields. So then we'll create a project in Visual Studio Tools. We'd reference the modified forms dictionary assembly, and then we can actually write our code against it. We'll build the project, and we can then deploy the final assemblies in the add-ins folder. So with this technique, we can't create new windows because modifier cannot create new windows. So we'll go and do another demo of this technique, and that will get us started. Okay, so popping into GP. Now, one thing I did forget to do here is I forgot to turn back on the user preferences. So I should probably do that now. We'll go back in here and turn it back to the action pane and relaunch GP. So now, while I've actually closed GP, and at the moment I'll save the project VBA. So I'm going to come in to my Visual Studio project. So while that's loading, one of the first things we need to do is actually run the DAG tool. So I actually have a batch file here that is set up to make sure I've got the permissions, and then it runs the DAG tool here it is, against Dynamics, and tells it to use the custom forms dictionary. And then it copies the resulting DLL to the appropriate location. So if I run the DAG tool, you'll see it'll elevate permissions, and then it will run the tool, and that gets me access to my modified forms. Okay, and you'll see here that the DLLs have now got today's date on them. So if we come back to our project, you'll see I have references here to the application dynamics, so that's all the dictionary for the dynamics. There's the modified forms, and then we have the Dexterity bridge, which is the link between Visual Studio and Dynamics. The code, again, I'll be including this in a blog post, so you'll be able to download it, but the code is based on the same functionality. It is going to use the duos to store the data. So I've started off with the creation of a duos read, a duos write, and a duos delete function, and these use the ability to access the tables and the dynamic user object store, which is actually called in Dexterity the sysy user object store, and it's the appropriate commands to read and write duos values. So then I've got triggers or handlers on the same locations. So I've got one when the window opens, I've got one on display existing record, which will pick up when a new record is displayed, one on save record, and then I've got one before and after the delete button to be able to detect my delete. So it's handling the same CRUD events, and the code is very, very similar, but written using, now this is actually in Visual Basic, but you can also use C#. So once I've got the code, I can then build my solution. And if we look down the bottom, you'll see that build has succeeded. So let's minimize that. And if I run this copy bat, it is going to copy the DLL, the customer UDF DLL, into the add-ins folder for me. Okay, so if I now go and have a look at the add-ins folder, you'll see the customer UDF is here. Okay, so we will relaunch GP. And log in. Now one thing is the VBA code is still in the system, so we can go in there and disable or remove that. So once we've got in GP and it's fully logged in, there we go. If we go to Customize and Visual Basic Editor. So this code is still here and still active. So what we can do is, if we click on the object, we can actually tell it to run the event mode of never, and that will disable the VBA component. So I haven't removed the VBA, but later on I probably will do that. But if I just save that and open up the window, and you'll notice that the dot that was previously after here for VBA is gone, but we still have this reason for change is working, and if I pull up a record, you'll still see it is still conference time. And if I save that, so now that's exactly the same code that's running, but now it's running through Visual Studio instead of VBA. So, and just so we can be sure of that, I'm going to say Tools, Customize, and remove the window from Visual Basic. And if I go back to the editor, you'll see that it's now gone from the editor. but it still works. Okay, so I'm going to pop out of GP here, and we'll delete that DLL. And that gets rid of the Visual Studio, and the DLL's gone. Okay, so we'll go back to our presentation, and we can move on to the next approach, which is using Microsoft Dexterity. So Microsoft Dexterity is actually the language that GP itself was developed in, and anything you write in Dexterity is immediately web client compatible, and that includes new windows. So if you want to create new windows, you can. Anything you create in Dexterity can be completely seamless. The user will not be able to tell where the customization starts and ends, because it is written in the same language and can be made to look identical. You can access any of the table structures. You can access functions, procedures, all the business logic. You can only modify core Dynamics GP windows with Dexterity. So if you want to modify a window that is in a third-party product, such as service management or project accounting, the normal method for that would be to create a parallel window that opens up at the same time. Or you could consider using a different one of the other methods if you really want it to be in the same window. It can develop cross-dictionary code, so we can have code that will run and go between the cross dictionaries, so you can have code running in Dynamics that then accesses Project or one of the other modules. We can, from version 14 onwards, using the .NET interop, we can access .NET resources. We can also create web services using service-based architecture, and again, that's from version 14 onwards. We also have the ability to create any new resources we like, so fields, tables, forms, windows, reports, etc. That's all part of Dexterity. So we'll jump into a Dexterity demo. So I've previously loaded Dexterity, and you'll see here what I've done is I've opened the customer maintenance form. So this is the same form that you would see in the modifier, and I've added the reason for change across the bottom, and the steps for that were identical to the steps we used in modifier. We added a local field, we put it in the correct position, added the prompt, linked the prompt, set the tab sequence. So this time we are registering our code and triggers against it using a startup script. So this is a script that registers triggers against those same events. So we've got one when the form opens, and I'll show you why we have that in a second. We've got the one when the window opens, so we can set the default value. We've got one on display existing record, so that handles our read event. Save record handles our update and create events, and then a trigger on the database on the table itself will handle our deletes for us. So now the reason we have a trigger on the form is when the form opens, we're going to check the security records and check whether our modified version or what is going to become an alternate version of the window is in use. And if it is in use, then we will allow our code to run. If our window is not in use, we won't allow our code to run, and so we don't end up with an illegal address error when we try to access the reason for change field when it's that our version of the window is not open. So we have our triggers. So here's our delete event. So we're using a command now. So we've created some new commands, new functions. I should go back to these. We created the delete, read, and write. So these are the same, very similar to what we used in Visual Studio. We just created the appropriate commands using the Dexterity syntax. So we're just clearing the table, setting the key fields, getting the table, and if we've got a record value, we show what it is. Otherwise, we return an empty value. So the code is very, very similar. So then when we delete from customer maintenance, we can just say, well, go and delete from the duos for that customer number. So we've got the similar triggers for reading and saving, and setting the default value. One thing to note is that all of the code is handled using triggers, and there is no actual changes or code on the customer maintenance window itself other than adding that field. So once all the code has been written, we can say compile our dictionary, and as long as we've got no errors, there we go, we're all good. We can close Dexterity and we can create our chunk file. So I've got the steps for that recorded as a macro, and that'll launch when I load Dexterity. So this is extracting the changes we've made and going through the process of creating a chunk. Alright, so now we have our CNK file, which is our chunk file, which is a self-installing dictionary file. And if we run copy, that will copy it into our application folder. And you'll see there it is, cust UDF. When we launch GP, it'll extract. Now I've got it set to extract automatically, which is a dex.ini setting. So it didn't actually ask me, did you want to include new code? But we did see the window flash up as it extracted it. So I'll log in. So remember that the VBA has been disabled and the Visual Studio Tools code, DLL, has been removed. So right now, if we go to the modified window, you'll see that there is no access to the data. And we're in. So if we go back up to here and we say modified window, while we can see the field, there's no data coming into it. So now if we want to see the dexterity field, we're going to need to change security to point to that. So if we were to go into administration, we can change under user security. Open up alternate modified, and let's say sales series and Windows. And if we open up the customer maintenance window, you'll now see that we have 3 versions. So what we'll do is we'll say to use the version in our custom dictionary and hit save. Now we're actually going to pop into GP Power Tools and tell it to allow us to choose the version in the dictionary as well. So if we go back to home and we open up customer maintenance, we now get the 3 choices. You can see that the default one with the asterisk is the one in our custom form. So we open up the original, we have no field. If we opened up the modifier, we have the field but no code to make it actually work, and we open up our dexterity based one and you'll see that we have reason for change, and because we're storing the data in the same place, our code just works, and you can see it's still functional. Okay, back to our presentation. And And the next section is Modifier with GP Power Tools. So GP Power Tools has 3 modules. It has an Administrator Tools module, a Developer Tools module, and a Database module. And the Developer Tools module gives us the ability to create customizations and replace VBA. So this is a technique you can use to replace VBA. It is web client compatible. The forms, again, are still modified with Modifier, but instead we use GP Power Tools triggers and scripts to add our code. And the scripts can be written in a combination of Dexterity, SQL, C#, and VB.NET. Even though we're primarily going to be using Dexterity and SQL, we only need to use C# and VB.NET if we want to access some .NET only functionality. There's no deployment necessary. As soon as you save your changes, they are available to all users because they're stored on SQL. There's no external development tools needed. You don't need Visual Studio tools or Visual Studio. You don't need Dexterity development environment. You don't need SQL Server Management Studio loaded. It does work with reports using report writer functions. It can work with modifier added fields, which Dexterity can't normally, and it can work with modal dialogues, which also Dexterity can't normally. It does also allow you to call from external sources into Dynamics, either using a URL link or using a service-based architecture web service call. Okay, so let's start on our demo. Okay, so we'll drop out of our presentation and into GP. We'll go to GP Power Tools, open our project setup. So our project allows us to combine all of the different elements of the customization into one location. This is currently my setup as my current project, so it opens automatically. Here's the modified form that we've attached from customization maintenance, and we have coded this with our 4 triggers. So we have our pre-event, which is on the window pre, and then has the script. And then we've got our read, and that is calling a duos get function, which is provided by GP Power Tools as a helper. We've got remove, which is doing a duos delete function, and then we've got our write, which is on the save event, and that is doing a set function, or if there's no data to be saved, it's deleting the individual item from that database. So my triggers would normally start automatically, but because I've been editing them, they're currently stopped, so I'm going to just manually start them. I'm going to open the form. I'm going to tell it to open the modified version of the form. And you'll now see that the reason for change is there. And if I pull up a record, and you'll see I've changed this to yet again, and save, and then bring it back, you'll see it's now working. So this is now the modified window, but the code is being done by GP Power Tools. It's all within the same system. You can see I was able to edit the code and run it without having to exit GP or deploy anything. There's no extra files. Okay. So stop the triggers. If we go back to our presentation, so we're going to talk now about Dexterity and service-based architecture. So the service-based architecture functionality, which was added for GP 2015, exposes a suite of global procedures as REST-based web services. This is different to the original SOAP-based web services that already existed in GP. The services can either be what they call a window wrap service, where the service procedure is driving the UI of the window, or they can be procedural code where it's actually just writing directly to tables. It does consume a license while it's running, and you can't make a second call using the same login to the same company it has to actually finish that first bit of code and exit before you can log in again. You can use multiple logins if you wanted to resolve that, but that also then would use multiple licenses. And it's the same as not being able to log into GP twice as the same user. It is very flexible in what it can do, but it doesn't have good performance. It basically will run at the same speed as GP because it is GP. It just it creates a session, logs into GP, does whatever it's asked, and then logs out. While SBA is still supported, it is not being developed any further. It's probably not the best tool for using for any large amounts of data input, but it is quite useful if you just want to automate something from outside of GP. Now, GP Power Tools also allows you to create custom service-based architecture, so you don't have to create it in your own Dexterity dictionary. You can actually use Power Tools to do it, and if you do that, there's no deployment of any dictionaries or restarting of services needed. You can just make the calls. So that pretty well covers the customization tools. Now we're going to go through integration tools. We don't have any demos for this section, so this will go fairly quickly. So we'll talk about the various tools that are available to you, but first of all, we've got to actually talk about what we mean by a GP integration. Is this going to be something that is just an initial setup, just importing the original master records, or is this something that's got continual updates between two systems or continual integration of transactions? Are we doing master records or are we doing transaction records? What sort of volumes are we talking about? Is this 1 or 2 records a day? Is this thousands of records? How is it going to be started? Is this something that can be started manually by the user and just pull in today's data? Or is this something that it has to be automated? And if it's automated, does it need to be polled, where it can run some sort of integration every hour or so, or does it have to be real time? Now, you could say polling 1 minute is close enough to real time to count as real time, but you can also have real time where you actually start the integration on demand. So then we need to understand, what's the experience level of the users that are going to be setting up the integration. What is the experience and skills of the user that's going to run the integration, and then how do we handle errors? If the integration fails for some reason, do we roll back? Do we continue and leave that record off? And how do we log that? So there's a lot of considerations to take into account. This slide is to help you think about all of that. The table import utility is something that was actually built into the Dexterity runtime, and it's always been there under the tools menu. It is available. It is only one step above directly importing data into SQL. It has no business rules or data validation, and it can only add records. It has no ability to update existing records. Because there's no validation, it has a really high risk of data corruption. The comment here is that most people don't know it exists. It's not recommended, and while it's been listed here for completeness. Go back a second. Firstly, we'll come to the table import tool. So this tool is actually part of the Dexterity runtime. It's always been built into Dynamics from the beginning. It is only one step above directly importing data into SQL itself. There is no business rules or database validation included. It only has the ability to add records. It can't be used to update any records. It has a really high risk of data corruption, and even though most people don't know it exists, that's good because we don't recommend you use it, and while it's been listed here for completeness, please now forget about it. Moving on. So Integration Manager. Most people know about Integration Manager. It is fairly easy to configure. It is normally a manual process that gets activated by the user. You've got multiple connectors and different endpoints, so it can have a connector that drives the user interface, which can be a little bit slower than going directly to tables or to eConnect, but it does mean it's more compatible with ISV products. because the triggers of those ISV products will fire and perform whatever actions that they would do if it had gone through the interface. You can integrate directly with SQL tables, and most common use is actually going through eConnect, where you've got the business rule validation. It does come with trial licenses when you first get GP, that you can use it to import all your data, but that only lasts for a certain amount of time and then it finishes. You really don't need much in the way of development skills, but if you do, you can write VB script to customize some of the functionality. eConnect is probably the most commonly used tool. It is a suite of SQL stored procedures which can then be called by a number of different APIs, so com, .NET, directly to the stored procedure. You can also use BizTalk or message queuing facilities, and it can also be wrapped in web services. It includes most of the business logic so that the data is actually validated. It includes almost all of the endpoints, so for most of the core GP features. One thing to note though is there is not 100% parity with the user interface, so there might be functionality that's available in the user interface that's not supported by eConnect. It can be customized with pre and post scripts, so they can be used to either add extra functionality that is not supported in eConnect itself, or just to store extra data or perform extra functions. So the SOAP-based web services are the older style web services. They are actually just wrappers for eConnect stored procedures. They wrap most of the eConnect endpoints, but not all of them. The installation and configuration, particularly the security aspect of the SOAP-based web services, is very difficult. Most people don't like using them, and they can be a pain. So there is a better way of doing it. We only support calls from .NET, but Steve Endo has published a method that he likes, where you use ASP.NET Core to wrap eConnect, and you can create a REST-based web service, which is much better and easier to use than the SOAP-based one. So then we have finally some third-party tools. I'm not going to go into huge details, but E1's solution Smart Connect is very popular. Tibco have got their Scribe product. There is a product from Kimwaysoft. Dell have actually got a Boomi product, and Jitterbit is another example. This is not a full list. I'm sure you can find other tools, but if you're looking at some of the different products, these are ones you can look at. So, some final thoughts. Compare and contrast your tools. There's lots of different tools, and you need to choose what is going to be the best tool for the job. Each tool's got strengths and weaknesses, and you can choose the one that works best for you. If you need to use more than one tool, don't feel scared about that. That is probably a good solution. It's whatever works and achieves the end result you're looking for. So hybrid solutions are a great way to go. So if you want more information, feel free to look up on my blog. That's winthropdc.com/blog, or contact me at david@winthropdc, or my Twitter account at winthropdc. Now that the session's over, we've got an opportunity to use the last bit of our time here to do a bit of a live Q&A. If you'd like to join me using the link below, which will take you to a Teams meeting, and then we can have a chat and I can answer any questions that you might have, or just say hi. I'd love to catch up with everybody. Please feel free to join me, and look forward to seeing you. Thanks a lot. So if you're doing surveys, please make sure you do a survey, and hopefully that will help them invite me back next year, which I'm hoping will be an in-person event for me in Australia. I know that you're there in person, but right now I can't travel out of Australia, but hopefully that'll change for next year. So thank you very much, and hopefully you enjoyed this, and will enjoy the rest of your conference.